but we are going to talk about the brain today. I could probably spend more than an hour talking about it. And in fact, when I was trying to decide what I was going to talk about, because I could talk about so many things, I really felt like I could have done a whole talk on maybe each of the slides I was doing. Um, so it's a pretty exciting topic, and I'm glad you guys are here. So let's get started. All right. All right. Let's just see what you guys have to say. What do you think is brain fog? Like, why are you here? What attracts you about the word brain and fog together? So what do you guys think it is?
Wanting to think more clearly and
Hmm.
being able to remember what's important.
Right?
Yeah, just being more focused, I think,
Yeah.
sometimes.
Focus, memory,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. And who doesn't want their brain to stay really top notch as we
Yes.
age, right? I think it definitely becomes more of a concern as we get older. Well, according to the National Health Institute, brain fog is a range of neurocognitive symptoms that include forgetfulness, problems focusing, concentration, and paying attention. So, all righty.
I'm not paying attention when my husband talks, but that's okay.
So why should we care about it? Why do we think we should care about it?
Can't keep your brain sharp.
Totally, right? I mean, the brain is responsible for who we are, how we think, what we feel. And so it really is fundamental to our lives and our relationships and then our health, really.
Well, it determines so many of our choices, right? So
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah, what do we think the problem is with what we know about brain fog? Like,
I think everybody wants to take a magic pill to make it better, and that's
yeah.
probably not the solution we're going to use.
I mean, you know me already, right?
I do, but I think they
Know some things about the brain
I
too,
do.
right?
I do.
Yeah, I think that definitely one of the problem is the information that often I find that Google works best if we know what we're searching for, right? And even some professionals that are out there, we have to ask the right question to get the right information. So,
You taught me that.
yeah,
Studies.
yeah,
Like a lot of times
right?
I'll come back with someone and I have a question. I'm like, well, here's the study that proves it.
That's
And
right,
so,
right? How can we get legitimate information from good sources? I think that's becoming a huge problem more and more. I'll ask somebody what your source is, and Google. Well, Google's not the source.
Right.
Google is the search engine. You have to look. So we've even gotten to that place now, right? Where we refer to Google or TikTok or Instagram.
Yeah.
Somehow those have become really valid sources. All right. So, one of the other problems I think is that we just don't understand how we're contributing to the problem. We're all contributing to it. And I think that's a huge mistake in how we're even seeking information, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there, but also I think there's a disconnect between um, finding that information and understanding what we can do about it. So these are some big ones that are affecting our brain, and maybe in a way where we do realize it, maybe we don't realize it. So we're going to kind of take on each of these because if you're here, you want to know what you can do, right? I'm going to talk about some other things as well, but I want to spend the bulk of it talking about the actual takeaway steps we can leave with today and have a greater understanding about this. And again, I could spend a whole talk talking about just these things. So each of these things. So I'm just going to highlight this. We're going to have some time for some Q&A after. If there's something burning question or you're like, how does this jump in? Please, we'll keep this, even though I'm standing up here with the PowerPoint, I do want it to be informal. I do want it to be a discussion. Heather, a nurse practitioner, is here. She might weigh in a little bit on some things. We accumulate knowledge differently, through our own interest and experiences. Okay, excitotoxins. Has anybody ever heard of this word before?
I probably have heard it, but I didn't know what it meant.
This is cool. Well, it's excitatory and it's a toxin. excitotoxin, right? And it literally, the term comes from the overstimulation, excitability to our neurons. And basically, our brain is composed of neurons. It's actually kind of another word for brain cells. So overstimulating, I read early on when I did research on excitotoxins that um, we can stimulate our neurons until they spin, 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 and then like blow up. So we can like do these things where it's just craziness and then lose that brain cell because we've exhausted it. And a lot of that has to do with chemical ingredients that we're ingesting. Some of the big ones are MSG, and everyone knows MSG as MSG, but sometimes it's written differently. And these are the things that we should be aware of. Artificial flavors is probably the most common way it's in our food source out there. If you're eating things that you find in a normal grocery store, you would see the word artificial flavors. Sometimes you can see on the front label does not contain artificial flavors because we're more keyed into that, right? But sometimes MSG is hidden in something called natural flavors. And as we're really conscious about the things we put in our mouths, we want to pay attention to that. Natural flavors is such a generic term, we don't really know what that means. And so just be really careful of that. And maybe even pay attention to, like I ate this and I feel this way. Maybe that's not lining up. Oftentimes, MSG will give us a headache. So if you've eaten something and you're kind of feeling like, oh, I kind of feel a little funny, my head kind of hurts, start to think about maybe it was something that you ate. Um, Autolyzed protein, this is broken down into a variety of different types of words, but usually the word autolyzed is associated with MSG. So it's gotten to the point where I used to say with food, if you couldn't pronounce it, don't eat it. Now it's really these tricky words like natural flavors. Well, you could pronounce it, and it's using the word natural, so it must be okay. But if we're really starting to think about our brain differently, then we need to think about those foods that we've gotten to a point where we're really invested in healthy food. We see it even in regular grocery stores. And so that's a really big indicator that we need to pay attention to the integrity of the company. And we may not know that, but we can tap into it by keywords like natural flavors. Okay, casein. Does anybody know what that is?
Dairy.
Yeah, it's a protein in cow dairy.
It's not goat dairy?
I think it's a different form.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know you have your podcast that talks about a little bit, but you seem to do better with that one. I just didn't know if it.
Yeah. And for some people, they're really sensitive to casein in a variety of different, but it is one of the proteins contained in mammal milk. And so mostly we find it in cows' milk. Cows' products are really the most inflammatory to us, not nearly as inflammatory as goat. So sometimes that gives us a little bit of flexibility, right? We don't want to be just like maybe I can't go without my cheese, right? We can transition a little bit more comfortably. The reason why it's an excitotoxin is that it can contribute to vascular health. And so cow dairy has a lot of problems associated with it. I have done whole podcasts on it. I've done whole chapters in books. I could do a whole talk on it. I just want to touch upon it for the brain because we can think about it. We compartmentalize dairy really easily. Oh, we shouldn't do it if we're trying to lose weight. Oh, we shouldn't do it if we're upper respiratory and congestion. But this is about the brain, so I'm going to talk about like how it affects the brain. Aspartame. There's hardly any chewing gum that doesn't contain aspartame. And so, like aspartame, like I talk about food with my family in terms of never some vacation eating, sometimes food, the almost never food. And I have to say that like food dyes, especially those red ones, which can really act as excitotoxin, and aspartames are the big ones that I'm like, never, 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 never. So really read your chewing gum labels. It can seem innocent enough, but it really is killing your brain cells. Okay. How should we think about alcohol? This is one that somehow we have culturally gone back to, like, I remember my parents' generation doing cocktail hour or cocktail parties, right? And then it wasn't really, aside from college, it wasn't really in our, and now we're back to it. We have this like culture of uh of coffee drinking, alcohol drinking, and it's really infected women's culture. It's I don't even know some of the terms. I'm trying to think on social media. What are some of the terms? Like mommy wine or what's it? There's something, right? There's some
into the happy hour and
yeah, there's some terms even going around now. Um, or even like the wine and cheese parties, because that's thought of as low carb, and but it's really back to being something that's being overconsumed, and we really need to think about it. I again could do a whole talk on this. Maybe I will, because I just see it becoming more. But it is one of the most inflammatory things that we do, that we can ingest. Um, and so anytime something is inflammatory, the frequency impacts that, right? So something that's inflammatory, if we're not doing it always, right? It doesn't maybe necessarily have to be a never, but how you structure it in terms of, is it going to be a sometimes? Is it going to be vacation? As I've gotten older, it's almost never for me. And it used to be more rarely, but again, as I am looking towards improving quality of my brain and my physical health and reducing inflammation in the face of aging, it becomes that much more important. Alcohol does affect memory, right? If memory is a really important part of how you define brain fog, then and that's a real problem for you, then that's a really, this is a really important piece. It can interfere in judgment. I mean, we know this in terms of, right, like people feel more relaxed and less inhibited, but it is impairing judgment. And so if we're doing it on a constant basis, then we're affecting the communication in our brain cells that are related to how we make judgments. Speech, it can affect speech. Again, usually we're thinking about that in terms of, oh, well, if someone has too much to drink, they're slurring their speech. But when these substances go after those parts of the brain, they're affecting it even at a micro level. And so if these kinds of faculties of the brain are really important, then we have to think about the micro damage we're doing by the slow intake of these things or the casual intake. And again, it may not be something that you choose to be never, almost never, but really think about the frequency and how you might be ebbing and flowing with your brain. Because our brain is actually a lot like our stomachs. It's a sponge. What we're putting in our mouth, we're sending to our brain. That's the bottom line that we don't really think about. We think that our brain is operating separately, or it's a part of the aging process and we have to accept it. Yes, some of it is part of the aging process, but it doesn't mean we have to just throw our hands up and completely accept that this is what is going to happen. I think that to me is like so frustrating when everything is like, oh, well, that's the age. That's because you're getting older, or that's the aging process, or that's just the way it is. Really, like how much of that is really like that's how it is, right? I think that a lot of us are here and invested in because we don't believe that everything has to be the way that it is, right? And if you just remember that, again, what you're putting into your stomach is what you're putting into your brain, that'll go a long way. It's shrinking the size of those neurons. If we really want good brain health, and part of the aging process is that we things might slow down, we might lose some of those. Then I certainly don't want to pour gasoline on that fire, right? If I'm going to be as part of the natural aging process, as I'm going to be losing some of my neurons or my neuron communication might slow down, I'm not interested in accelerating that or adding to it. So again, if something is a focus for you in terms of brain health, then you really want to look at your frequency of alcohol consumption. Caffeine. This is another one that we're seeing shift culturally, especially with information. If you put into Google the benefits of caffeine, you'll see a bunch of stuff that comes up. And this has become a way of losing weight, sharpening the brain. Yeah. It's a way of even sometimes controlling headaches. And you really have to seek out what is the downside of caffeine to have it come up. And if you put caffeine and brain fog, if you put any of these in Google, you can see what comes up. Often when I use the Google search engine, because I'm spending so much time in clinical data, it's the first thing that comes up, but put it in after, caffeine and brain fog, clinical data, or caffeine and brain fog studies and see what comes up, because it really will start to expand you thinking about this. Oftentimes, caffeine is such an important part of our culture that I'm very careful and selective about how I talk about caffeine, but it does disrupt communication between the brain and the body. It's affecting the quality of our sleep. Same with alcohol, the quality of our sleep. Here's what's so important about that to the brain. Your brain is cleaning out while you sleep. That's a simple way of kind of understanding it, is that your brain is doing this amazing clean out, and it can't do that efficiently if alcohol and caffeine are in the way. Mm-hmm. You think about it really simple like that. That's something I really like to do, is really simplify things into some key takeaways. So you may still be able to get to sleep. And so you may feel like, oh, caffeine doesn't make me jittery. I can still go to sleep. I'll still do it. But the reality is it's affecting the way your brain cleans out. It's affecting the communication between your brain and your body. So again, just start to look at, how often do I want to do this? And, is that something, because it doesn't necessarily have to be, well, I'm never doing that again. Unless that's specific, if I'm working with someone and they are in memory loss and they haven't done these preliminary steps with their diet, they may be the first steps that we're talking about. It can behave as a neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitters are things that are directly affecting our mood. They are regulating things like anxiety and depression. And so for some people, it can be really stimulating, and they think they're getting essentially what is dopamine, but it is at the expense of some of the other neurotransmitters. It is actually perpetuating anxiety and slowing down those neurotransmitters. So it can put the brain in a state of awkward stimulation leading to slowdown. Right? A lot of people that start their day with caffeine, maybe they're not doing caffeine in the afternoon because they feel like it's not going to help, it's going to interfere in sleep, but they're looking for something else, maybe chocolate in the afternoon, because there is that real adrenal crash that happens with caffeine if it's really hitting your body in a way that is stimulating. Coffee specifically does contain some of the highest amount of mold and pesticides. And when you combine those with a stimulant, and you get up into the brain like that, that can be that much more compromising to the brain function. So that's something to think about too. Mold is very trendy right now in holistic and functional worlds. Mold panel, we all have mold. We don't get the majority of it from our environment. We actually get the majority of it from what we're eating, from coffee, from cereal grains. They're called cereal grains, but from grains itself. It contains the highest amounts of mold. I just heard recently in a talk that Starbucks buys some of the lowest grade coffee, which has the highest amount of mold in it.
Wow.
I know.
You think there would be
we have
higher
this
quality there?
Yeah, no, well, they never promised high quality, right? This is what just because their price point is higher, but it is really such a cultural normal thing now that we never stop to ask what it might be doing to our health. And you combine caffeine, sugar, and the dairy, the casein, I mean, you just like, oh, goodbye brain,
Yeah. Not the best way to start the day.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So then this leads me into sugar. And, I think people just don't want to really talk about sugar. Again, I could do a whole talk on this. But again, in terms of like, what do we need to think about sugar in regard to the brain? Okay, is big things. Sugar equals brain fog, and sugar will literally shrink the brain, and sugar will atrophy our brain cells. So if you want to make a huge step in terms of, and these are kind of the big ones, but we have a lot of control over that as a culture and society, we're not really talking about these things because there's a ton of profit in processed foods. There is a ton of profit in these coffee drinks and the cultural norm that it is. There is a ton of profit in sugar. The history of sugar is one of the coolest things. Um, if anyone's ever interested, I think it's called The Sugar Blues. It was one of the first books I read more than a decade ago about sugar. And it was used as a drug when it was first discovered. It was used to enslave people, um, much the way that third world countries sometimes use heroin and cocaine to enslave people into guerrilla warfare. It was used in military, it was used in slavery, and until it became through the trade up through England when um, all of that was kind of discovered. But it was known to be a drug, and it behaves very similar to morphine and cocaine on the brain. So it's very addictive. Um, it is probably next to caffeine, the legalized drug that we don't talk about that's available to everyone, even babies. And when we are in brain development phases like infancy to toddler and puberty, which is another big brain development, frontal lobe, all of that. We're not spending enough time talking about the impact of sugar on the brain. So this is a really big one. I think we think about sugar so narrowly in terms of our teeth. When it comes to our kids, we really need to be having the conversation about sugar and the brain. When I see the word atrophy and shrinking brain, I'm like, oh, maybe I will never do this again. But that's not always going to be a reality, right? But it is something that, it's always good reminders for me to do these kinds of talks too. Things float to the top that sometimes have trickled down to the bottom. All right. So what do we think the problem is now? And what do we think more problems might be?
How to change those habits.
Yeah. 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 Are you thinking differently about the things you're putting in your mouth and the brain?
Sure.
Totally, right? Yeah, totally. Okay. All right. So, in terms of like measuring some of the impact of these foods and drinks, there are functional ways of looking at this inflammation, these imbalances. But I also want you to know how these things weigh in terms of like a functional issue, right? So the symptom is brain fog. Where do we look functionally to examine all the deficiencies that might be contributing to it? So we're going to look at, what we're doing at home, diet and lifestyle, and then what could be going on chemically in functional testing. So hormonal imbalances are huge to look at. Um, Things like estrogen really impact the brain. And so knowing what your estrogen is doing, we look at hormones differently. Hormones are your gut are your hormones. Hormone disrupting foods, caffeine, alcohol, sugar, gluten, dairy. Those are the big hormone disruptors. And so if we want, you'll find there's a lot of overlap to these foods and these imbalances, cortisol imbalances. One of the big things we do to disrupt our adrenals is caffeine. And if caffeine is going to increase anxiety, then that's going to increase our cortisol imbalances, which then the body thinks it's in fight or flight too often, which is then going to perpetuate the stress response. and we're stuck in a loop that we then stay stuck in because we're constantly feeding that beast. And so really understanding, okay, like, do I want to not just give up alcohol and sugar for Lent, or give it up for, I think people are calling it dry January. It's not that they're giving it up as a New Year's resolution anymore. It's going to be have a beginning and an end. But just again, starting to think about what am I doing? Hormone imbalances are thought about as just what happens with age. And this, to me, again, is another problem around communication, is that we should just be okay with this. We can be, that's our choice, and it is for many people, but it doesn't have to be if we're gathering information and understanding it in a different way. A significant amount of our health is ours to participate in. All right, so hormonal imbalances, looking at what your hormones are doing. I've done whole talks on this. So adrenals tie into the hormones, but I don't think people think about their brain health and they go right into, oh, I really need to look at my hormones. I think women, as we get older, think about hormones, hot flashes, night sweats, libido. That's it. And we don't think about brain health as being a big part of it. So we need to think about that. Looking at neuroinflammation, looking at neurotransmitter imbalances. Those kinds of functional testing are really important, because you're not only looking at like essential fatty acids, like omegas, but you're looking at how your body might be absorbing them. There's relationships with these things too. Like our body needs way more omega-3 than it does omega-6. Most processed food is going to lead the charge in omega-6. And then this disrupts the ratio of 3 to 6, which then creates some neuroinflammation. And so your brain may not have as much attention, concentration, acumen if that ratio is up. So not just looking at processed food and the ingredients being excitotoxins, but are you consuming too many vegetable oils, trans fats, some things that create high amounts of omega-6 in the brain when your brain needs way more omega-3? So that's another way of thinking about the brain too. Heavy metals. We are actually seeing more heavy metals in functional testing than ever before. I would say the first maybe even like 12 years of being in practice, I could count on one hand people that came in with heavy metal toxicity. Now, it seems, I don't know, like
it's rare to not have it.
Yeah, it's like one every three people. Well, a lot of it is protein powders. We're a powder generation, greens powder, protein powder. So people that are even trying to do some healthy things. So protein powder should say third-party testing, that they're doing regular quality control to measure metals, because we're seeing more and more come in on that. And the majority of people, now some metals are coming in from people that are eating tuna too often. Their work environment may put them around chemicals. Breast implants, believe it or not, slowly leak mercury, even if they're not leaking. So there's a few things that are some drug use that really does that, but the majority of people that we're seeing come in with this can trace it back to a protein powder, some kind of powder, collagen powder, some kind of protein bar, because it's all about protein out there right now, right? And so
what should you look for on these things?
Third-party testing.
Third-party testing.
Yeah.
It says no mercury, tested for mercury.
Yeah, tested for metals, heavy metals, right? Because we can see mercury, lead, sometimes aluminum in them. Sometimes lead is in like bottled juices because it's coming from a manufacturing plant that still has lead in their pipes. So, when we're buying bottled juices, we're thinking it's juice. Yes, it's also water supply from where? A factory from where? Where is that coming from? And so we have to think about that. But
the lipstick.
Oh yes, lipstick. I mean, yes, the statistics are crazy. Something like 5 pounds of lipstick a year is in our body, because just from licking our lips, and so barium is one. Barium has been linked to breast cancer. That's bismuth is another. So there's some other really strange minerals happening in our skin, in our skincare products. Our skin is an ingestible organ. It ingests 65% of what we put on it topically. People don't think our skincare, we need to worry about the chemicals in that. We absolutely do. And so things that we put on our mouth are that much more vulnerable too. Things we put under our arms, like deodorant, right? Making sure deodorant doesn't have aluminum in it. That's a pretty important thing for our brain health. And sometimes people are saying, well, the deodorant doesn't work. So our body sends us messages all the time that something's wrong. And if we can't use a natural deodorant without really having terrible body odor and it's not associated with a particular thing, like, like some people get really nervous public speaking and that can make them sweat and that can have a different odor. But in general, if people are just walking around really smelly, there's a chance there's something going on inside that needs to be addressed. And looking at their elimination system, because the body's just trying to eliminate. So are they having regular bowel movements? Is it a good, healthy bowel movement on an ongoing basis? So some questions to start asking, because to ignore that message and then buy a really heavy chemical deodorant that has aluminum and then not understand that all of that is leading to our brain health can be a gap in our thinking. We went over those dietary factors. Histamines, this is something that I'm really big on lately, because I think that COVID has made this a bigger problem than it was before. We see a lot of people in histamine crisis. This was another thing that just rarely used to be. I do blame it on COVID, whether people had COVID and knew they had COVID, might have COVID, didn't know they had COVID, had a COVID vaccine. I think that this is the new immune landscape, and histamines can affect the brain because they can impact the way our vagus nerve activates our parasympathetic nervous system. So basically, if we eat histamine foods, or if we're under chronic stress and our body is going to, our own cells can release more histamines, then again, we need to be really careful about our brain's ability to detoxify and clean out our brain, because that is going to create this environment where it all just doesn't line up. So I do think that that's something that you're going to hear me talk about more and more. We're talking about it in the office. We've got some resources that we're putting available on the website. It gets connected into hormone as well. And again, that stress response can affect cortisol, right? So if the histamines have gotten too high and are affecting your stress response, that's going to affect your adrenals, which is going to affect your cortisol, which is going to affect your neurotransmitters, right? But it's also going to affect your hormones, because the more histamine we have, the more likely we are somewhere in our body to be estrogen dominant. And then the more estrogen we have, the more histamines we make and get stuck here too. And so stay tuned for my next talk on histamines, because I can't wait to do that. But it is a piece of it. So we all need to know that these things are contributing to our brain health. And then therefore, if they're not optimized, can contribute to our brain functioning less optimally than we want it to. And the sooner you get involved in it, because just like anything, the more chronic something is, the harder it is and the longer it is to resolve. Genetics. Okay, so when genetics first came out as being something we could test for, we were talking about genetic mutations, but really what we were doing is testing genomic markers. So genetic mutations are actually a very specific classification of genetics, and most people are getting their genomic markers tested. The big thing is that when it first came out was something that we were all doing, it looked like, oh, this is going to be the new entrant. This is the new expanded version of preventative health, because wouldn't you want to know what your risks are? There were two primary risks for Alzheimer's, the APO epsilon 2 and 4. Now that we've fully accumulated all the genetic data, the genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's is it's like over 25. It's like 2 pages long. So the phrase that I borrow from Stanford that I love is, now that we've mapped all the genome, we're all at risk for everything.
Okay.
Like that's kind of where we've come to with that. So really, and Alzheimer's is a whole other conversation. There's at least 8 different subclinical diagnoses on that, and some of them connect to these, like diet, type 3 diabetes, like heavy metals, and environmental toxins, like hormone imbalances, like estrogen.
Alcohol.
Yeah, alcohol. So there is a lot of connection to what we've talked about. Even if we shifted the title of this to Alzheimer's, we could go into those specific diagnoses and the protocols for them, but a lot of it overlaps. Sleep is a big one. Again, your brain does a clean out while you sleep. It's one of the most important things we do for our brain, which we don't even really think about.
So how many hours should we be getting?
So 7 to 8 if you're an adult. It restful.
Without snoring, with precision.
Yeah, without being in this state of cortisol flaring in the middle of the night, and you're up at 2, 3 in the morning and you don't know why. You can't go back to sleep. Histamines, you gotta get up and pee in the middle of the night. There are some things that our body, again, messages our body is telling us when the detox cycle during sleep feels compromised. So, even the stimulation, the melatonin production. I mean, melatonin is not just a sleep hormone, it suppresses insulin production. So when we're releasing melatonin, we are not supposed to be in digestion, we are not supposed to be eating. So late night snacking can compromise the way the body wants to function during sleep. There's some really cool devices that show how compromised sleep is during alcohol consumption, that the recovery is just really not there. So yeah, this epigenetics is the environment we put the cell in. It makes up 70% of our risk factors for anything. So when people talk about family history, what they're really talking about, which we don't talk about enough, is the diet and lifestyle habits that get passed on, the relationship with food, the relationship with anything that might create more inflammation and create out of balance to our body. Stress, how we're navigating stress, that gets passed on. And so when we talk about family history in terms of genetics for things like cardiovascular, type 2 diabetes, all of these things, we need to also, again, the language is part of the problem, and the information, it's not a big enough picture. Family history isn't just genetics, it is looking at the epigenetic piece of it. And that means looking at what your family passed on to you in terms of your relationship with food, boundaries with food, your stress management habits, your lifestyle, how important is exercise, and things of that nature. So that's a big part of really what we should be talking about. Okay, so I think I kind of maybe already did this, but yeah, looking at your hormones, we do something called a neurohormone panel. You'll look more extensively at, I like to call it also the stress panel. So really, if a big part of how we're managing our brain health is managing our stress, then you want to get more information and not just do regular hormone testing. Our Nutri-Eval is really great for looking at all those measuring those acid levels that contribute to that inflammation, looking at histamines, looking at gut health,
toxins,
looking at toxins, looking at heavy metals. Yeah. And again, the genetic markers are going to keep you compartmentalized into thinking that you're not going to have control. There are genetic markers that are sufficient and necessary, like Huntington's disease or missing chromosomes. Those things are inescapable, and those are true genetic mutations that are inescapable. But even like the BRCA1 gene is now, there's a whole new conversation around that. So a lot of genetic markers being genomic markers, while they're going to increase risk, they don't define the path that you're on. They need to be factored in when you look at your epigenetics, which is what is going on in real time, impact of your diet and lifestyle on your chemicals.
So the way that someone says it is like your environment, your lifestyle turns off and on your genetic marker.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not predetermined.
It's not
How they're going to
predetermined.
be expressed.
Yeah.
On how you're living.
Yeah. Because you can take three people, right? You can take person A who has a genetic risk. So we're talking about brain. So we'll do, usually if I do this one on type 2 diabetes, because it's a little bit easier to understand. Well, let's talk about it. If person A has a genetic risk factor to Alzheimer's, but they doing all this other things, they're less likely, right? They're minimizing their risk. Person B has no genetic risk, but they're not paying attention to their health at all and exposed to all these things. They're moving in that 70% window, right?
Yeah, the majority of people that have Alzheimer's do not have the positive equity.
There you go.
So that's interesting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there you go. It's so interesting to me that when we start to study things like this and we've convinced ourselves that we're stuck in some sort of genetic pattern, even like menopause, right, or age, right? The early clinical studies I read were about underdeveloped countries that had no symptoms. Like to me, that set me on a path of being really passionate about menopause and hormones because it was like, okay, what's the difference?
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
The difference is diet and lifestyle. And there's a ton of different studies like this that start to look at locations, right? Blue zone, right? I will tell you the one thing that's not talked about enough in blue zone, areas where people are the more of the population is hitting 100 is called a blue zone. And so there's a whole diet piece around blue zone. But almost all those places are coastal. And so I'm entirely convinced that there's not enough talk around the stress.
Stress and walking.
Yeah.
Moving.
They are walking. They have a whole different way of the pace of life is different. Yeah, I mean, it's just so fascinating to me. It's like we want to talk about different countries doing different things, and we don't expand that into talking about everything that goes into our health, from the lifestyle, the exercise, the sleep, the stress, all of it. So it's a big deal. So you can ask yourself, what am I doing that needs to change? And really, it's not about judging yourself because that's just going to add stress. It's just about being honest and just going, okay, this is what I'm doing, and doing it with eyes wide open. A lot of people, when they start working with us, they just weren't aware, right? We want to bring awareness into the process so that people can start having conversations with themselves. Not, I'm never going to have alcohol again, but I went on vacation. I had two glasses of wine. I should have had one. I felt like this, right? It's no longer what's wrong with me. It's about having a better conversation about why I did this and now I paid this consequence, or it's going to take me this long to recover. I had a setback. So we're changing the language. We're changing the conversation, not just about the information that needs to be in you guys' hands to make these decisions, but you'll have a different language with yourself. And that's really important for us too. We can make small changes all the time to big gains. This is the thing that if something in what I talked about is like, well, I'm never going to do that. It doesn't have to be that way. You can really break it down into the smallest of changes. If you're doing 4 cups of coffee a day, turn that fourth one into a half cup and start there until you feel comfortable. And then it's the next step. It's then turning that into decaf and then dropping it. And how do you need to space it out? Sometimes I'm like so proud of people. They think they're going to start with a baby step and they do, but somehow the confidence that they've gained in actually taking that on for themselves moves them into the next step and the next step. It's sometimes a person that takes on too much, them going, slow it down. I promise you, I know you want to get there, but you have taken it on too hard and too fast, and you're going to feel frustrated, overwhelmed, and give up. So really, the small changes are important and actually are way more sustainable. And you can clip through them at a faster, but it's the small changes that are going to empower you. Make a promise to yourself, right? It can be today, it could be every day you wake up and go, yeah, what am I going to do for me to change the language, to have a better conversation with myself, to make a movement in my own health and wellness. It's exciting. It's not about the results. It is about the journey. And part of that is the language you're going to use with yourself. Okay. I think that when we start talking about the brain, people get really afraid. And yeah, like, who wants things to affect their brain? It's who we are, right? I mean, that's where we start in the beginning of the talk. It's how we think, it's how we feel, it's how we're in relationship to people. But we really don't have to be afraid because if you think about it in terms of, what I'm putting into my gut is what I'm putting into my brain. It's an important part of my body that is flexible, it's changeable, it's dependent on what I do to feed your brain, and give your brain rest and all those things. And just think about it as a part of yourself that you can participate in. Because ultimately we're afraid of the things we don't know and the things we can't control. So hopefully you're leaving here today with more knowledge, right? You will know more than when you started. And if you know more and can think differently and can make small changes, you're going to be more in control. And then that's going to make you less afraid. And then in all actuality, that's going to help your stress response, which will help your brain. So it's all good, right? Again, that epigenetic piece, we have way more control than we think, even if we are afraid of a family history of something. That epigenetics piece, just remember that environment accounts for 70% of what is actually happening to our genes. And just by being here, right? You're changing that.
Changing our thoughts.
Changing your thoughts. All right. So what do we think some solutions are that we've talked about?
Smaller goals and smaller changes.
Cool.
Instead of putting so much pressure on yourself.
Yes. Don't put pressure on yourself. Yeah. Because that might set you up in a way that is going to feel like you're not successful, right? And it isn't really about success. It's about the journey and how do we evolve in our journey.
I think one of the things that you've taught me over the years and replays in my mind, I don't always make the right choice, but I hear the voice, is, you don't always have to reward it with sugar. You could go on a walk, or you could do another option, or you could take fruit instead of the sugar as your natural, So I think reminding myself there are other options.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great way to temper the language about, well, if this is going to affect me and I would like to make a change, what can I do differently? Because the reward center of the brain exists. It's evolved as part of our survival. So it's going to be reward seeking. We just are culturally set up to do it with sugar.
And how many events do you go to that there's just sugar?
Yeah. I mean, you can't even go to the dentist without them rewarding for sugar. The classroom where we're supposed to be developing and nurturing the brain is one of the biggest places where sugar is given. So yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about manageable steps, right? You can avoid the chemical ingredients as much as possible. Just start putting on your thinking cap when you go to the grocery store. And even if you can just take one item at a time, I'm going to change my cereal. I'm going to move into something that doesn't have excitotoxins in it. And then next I'll do the sugar part. again, manageable steps. Track your food for 2 weeks. Once we write things down, you'd be amazed at how revealing what you're doing is when you are accountable to yourself. Set new boundaries with alcohol. If this is something you're doing every day, then you might want to think about it. And again, there's a variety of different support around that kind of thing that you might need to tap into. If you need caffeine, if you really need it, if you feel like you need it, I'm going to encourage people that are not here and listening to get an adrenal panel, because we really need to know why you need the caffeine for fuel. Get your hormones checked. It is never too young to start checking your hormones. In diagnostic medicine, there is not as much interest in testing that. Functional medicine, definitely with us, we're very interested in that. Check your gut health, again, because so much of what affects the brain we're eating. So look at how your gut is behaving with what you're eating. Check those nutritional deficiencies, heavy metals, other things that we can do in the Nutri-Eval. Work on your sleep, okay? If you stay up too late, start trying to go to bed just 10 minutes earlier, and then make that 15, and then make that 20. So it doesn't have to be like, oh, I need to go to bed an hour sooner than what I normally do. And you lay down and you're awake for an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've reset your rhythms in your body. So move that the same way that you would like. Start weaning yourself on caffeine. Move it in 15-minute chunks, 10 to 15 minutes. And once you've mastered that new time frame, move it again. Right? Children, I think I didn't answer this. Children under the age of 12 need 10 to 12 hours of sleep. They do say that once you start puberty, you need less, but I'll argue that teenagers actually need more. They're back into a developmental phase. But most teenagers, in all actuality, aren't even getting 8 hours. And they are saying that one of the huge risks for Alzheimer's is a sleep disorder. It is one of the ways they are looking at it, and it's starting in childhood. So they're saying things now like if children and teens aren't getting enough sleep, they're increasing their epigenetic risk and the way their genetic markers will behave as they get older. So sleep is really, really important. Limit your screen time. There, again, I could do a whole talk on this. Affecting those brain cells, affecting neurotransmitters, going to really impact your sleep. Okay, real quick, definitely just wouldn't be doing everyone justice really if I didn't just put in a little blurb here on Dopossess. It's a proprietary formula I created because I felt like some of the brain supplements that were out there didn't do enough to clean the brain and improve communication. And then some of them had caffeine in it. So if you want that brain pick-me-up without the caffeine while you're doing good things for your brain and cleaning it out, we've got some samples here for you. And I'm really proud of the product. I think that it's just doing really well. People are really happy with the results. So definitely if I'm talking about the brain, talk a little bit about the Dopossessed. Yeah. Okay, we want better brains. All right, think about how much better your brain can be over time instead of as I age, my brain is going to be less. Change that language and think I could make a better brain over time. All right. Again, learn what your functional imbalances are that contribute to your brain. Take real steps to make those diet and lifestyle changes. Change the conversation with yourself. That can help your brain. Yay. New thinking, action steps, better brains. Yay. All right. Any questions?
It's been a good reminder and of overview of all the things, just which things I made improvements on and which ones that like I could keep making. So,
Yeah, cool.
And then the omega-3 and 6, I think that was a good. I'd heard different things about 3, 6, and 9, so that was good to hear the specifics on it.
Good.
So,
Thanks. Yeah. Excellent. Good. Yeah. It's always even good for me when I start doing these things and organizing my thought, good reminders of what needs to float to the top in conversation with people and conversation with myself. It's really easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and the stress of life and forget to take care of things. Push it down, kick the can, push it down the road, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll manage that later. Yeah.
Totally, especially as women. Yeah, high performing, high functioning. Cool. Heather, did you want to add anything?
Blueberries.
Oh, yes. Yay. Blueberries, superfood for the brain.
Research studies show benefit of a cup of blueberries a day. So
My mother-in-law's doing great with that.
Oh,
She's
really?
87, yeah, and she literally like probably a cup a day.
So our brain makes plaque just like our teeth do. And so blueberries are like toothpaste for the brain. Just a really easy way to think about it. Um, Even the Center for Age-Related Diseases has been studying blueberries effect on the brain. So yeah, add a quarter cup of blueberries to your breakfast. Before noon, your brain really wants to use those calories. So it's a great way of just enhancing, your brain health. Low histamine food, like rich in phytonutrients. Like you can't say enough great things about blueberries. And it's blueberries. Somebody asked me today about, well, I'll alternate with strawberries. It's just blueberries.
Okay, good enough.
Blueberries brain. Strawberries, not the brain.
Okay.
All right, good. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.